afternoon, Rotarians and guests, and welcome to the Rotary Club of Toledo. Now would be a great time for you to pull out your phones, turn down your ringers, and check into your social media and see if you want to share something that you hear today about the update for Ukraine, and then once you do that, turn your ringer down. Thank you. I'd like to ask Jane Marie Ray to come over to lead us in the to deliver the reflection and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
When I signed up, I was like, it'll be pretty easy, and I'm pretty confident I'll nail the Pledge of Allegiance, but on the reflection, it did take a little time. And in this society and what we're doing right now, I didn't want to offend anybody, but I wanted to be authentic. So I found this from a great woman, and I hope it sits well with everyone. People are often unreasonable, irrational, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you will win some unfaithful friends and some genuine enemies. Succeed anyway. If you are honest and sincere, people may deceive you. Be honest and sincere anyway. What you spend years creating, others could destroy overnight. Create anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, some may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today will often be forgotten. Do good anyway. Give the best you have, and it will never be enough. Give your best anyway. In the final analysis, it is between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway. Mother Teresa. I thought I was going to nail it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Jane Marie. I'd like to thank February's meeting sponsor, Gary Murphy, better known as Murph, and his Impact Products. Does anyone have any guests they would like to introduce today? And if so, if you could come over to the floor mic right behind Chuck Stocking there.
With me today, I have President of the Buffalo Soldiers, Earl Mack, otherwise known to his group as Tavana. And secondarily, the Honorable Paula Hicks Hudson, our state senator from District 11, is on her way to join us. So, those two folks.
All right. Thank you. Any other guests? Any visiting Rotarians with us today? Okay. And I'm happy to see that John Romer is in the house today. We've been holding on to this wonderful Paul Harris Award for you that most of you know. If you donate up to $1,000 to Rotary International, they issue you an award and certificate for your generosity. So if John could come up here to receive his Paul Harris, that would be super. And briefly, I'd like to give a shout out to those that attended the Rotaract Rotary Happy Hour last week at My Way Bistro. It was a huge success, and if we can keep these young professionals intrigued and excited, we have a great number of future Rotarians in our pipeline in a very short time. So thank you all that were there, and thank you to Mark Uridia and his crew who are doing a really fabulous job with this. If Shanda Gore could come up to the podium, she's going to give us an announcement in honor of Black History Month.
Thank you so much. I had the privilege a couple of weeks ago to be, I'd say, out of town away from you, but actually in a group of individuals who are carrying not only Black History Month, but DEI initiatives forward. And, you know, it's, I want to thank President Cindy and everyone for really paying attention to the comments that were made concerning the opportunity for listening to those inventors. And so I don't know how many were here for that, but I truly appreciate that. It's so important to have that history. I wanted to share with you today about a poem. Actually, it was from a St. Ursula student, and it talks about 28 days. And so for those that know the calendar, of course, Black History Month is 28 days. But this young lady, Miss Terry Goulant, she's a junior at St. Ursula, I think captured the moment in saying, you know, Black History Month and any of the heritage months are really beyond those days that are on the calendar. And so I say it as beyond time and space. And I'd like to emphasize there are so many great inventions and firsts that are occurring, not only on a national level, but actually impacting in our local area. So, you know, taking the moment, especially within your organizations, to recognize those that are contributing is so very important. So today I wanted to share just some elements, kind of that map for those that are building a culture for diversity beyond Black History Month as we get ready to leap into Women's History Month, which is exciting. Making sure the map that you have inclusiveness of all dimensions and having designated individuals who can guide the process. And I say this and stress this to you as I just came from another meeting, beyond passion, making sure they have education area, experience, and solid metrics. As there are so many, especially with DEI positions that are out there, it's so critically important that you're guided and have that built into an organization. So adequate support, and I like to say the 3 C's: consistency, communication, and care. And so if doing a workshop or coming out and starting a program is fantastic, but we really want to push to make sure there's consistency when delivering a message, and remember that everyone is part of that diversity story. Sustaining a culture for diversity. I do suggest for those that have DEI programs or are considering them to look at what you currently have and to look at these additional initiatives for sustainability. I don't know how many of you have ever done a culture climate engagement survey. It's different than some of the other surveys you might be experienced, but I do recommend it if you're running a company or part of that to do one. Satisfaction levels, attitudes. It's amazing for recruitment and retention of populations. DEI strategic plans, the B is in parentheses concerning belonging, because that's a new term. I know in my firm we've been doing it for a number of years, and belonging is a new term that you might hear. Heritage months, that's the Black History Month, the Women's History Month we're getting ready to go into. But educational and training workshops, so critically important. Employee resource groups, ERGs, affiliate groups, creating a space for them to have a voice. Tools, the Intercultural Development Inventory, IDI, those are, if you've never heard of that, that's something that you would want to consider for staff. And then advanced initiatives, what I would say, supplier diversity programs. So I do at this moment, I had a picture of myself that, again, I was at 2 weeks ago when you had I was actually at the Big Ten offices. And so the COC, the Collegiate Officiants for the consortium, the Big Ten, the MAC, you know, the refs, the officials, they're with these games, and some of them were NFL officials. They're doing it on a national level. I work with them. And so I want to encourage you all to consider programs, again, beyond Black History Month. Consider the opportunity for recruitment and retention within your own organizations. I did have, if anybody has any questions or needs any support, you can reach me as well. So, So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shanda. And you can keep your ears and eyes peeled for more of these Heritage Month updates coming. Next month, like she mentioned, it's Women's History Month, but we also have an important one, Irish History Month, just in time for St. Patty's Day. Next up to the mic is Janina Douglas to give us an update on the donations that we made for the Ukraine crisis earlier this winter.
Thank you, President Cindy. Okay, good afternoon. I've got 3 minutes to talk a little bit about the project, and that was our Ukrainian Crisis Fund project. Take a look at my slide and read what it says. $51,000 raised for humanitarian aid. Our goal was 50. We overshot it, which is a good thing. We did it in exactly a month over the holidays, so give yourselves, this club, and this district a hand for a job well done for that. There are just 3 things that I want to say quickly about it. First is some thank yous. Thank yous to the many, many so generous Rotarians in our club, in our district, including including an incredible matching donation by one of our Rotarians. Thank you to the Greater Toledo Community Foundation for giving us an online site for donations to flow through, which made everything go so smoothly. And thank you to our club's International Service Committee for authorizing and supporting this project. Second, I want to mention the 2 organizations on the other side of the Atlantic that we worked with on this. The first is the Rotary Club of Warsaw, Poland. And by the way, a little tip of the hat here to Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, who was actually the person that put us in touch with the Rotary Club in Warsaw. This club has managed projects assisting Ukrainian refugees. As you probably know, literally millions of people have become refugees in this war, and we're going to hear about that, I'm sure, today. The club in Warsaw has managed over $300,000 in donations to assist with the refugees that have come through or are staying in Poland. And they brought in their partner to work with us, the American School in Warsaw, which is a school of almost 1,000 students. They're high school, but also grade school. And an essential part of their curriculum in that school is service. So they are taught, it's not just to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. You have to incorporate service into your plans for your life. And you can see in the pictures here, the picture on the left is actually a lineup of people who are waiting for food boxes that are distributed. And they actually run it's a resource center. So it's the American School together with the Rotary Club of Warsaw that run it. They've been feeding up to 700 refugees a day. And the students volunteer a number of ways. One of the ways is the little picture on the right, which is by packing the boxes up that are then distributed. The last thing I want to say is that the needs of the refugees and the people of Ukraine, sadly, will go on for years and years. Even if the war ended today, they will be in need for a long, long time. And they'll need Rotary clubs and other humanitarian organizations to step up and be involved. So we've asked the Rotary Club of Warsaw if they would be willing to become a host and an organizer for something that Rotary calls project fairs. It's similar to, if anyone here is familiar with the Uniendo project fair that goes on in Central America. Are people familiar with that? Many are. We have a lot of experience in our club with that project fair. If you're not familiar with it, I really suggest that you go to one of the International Service Committee meetings where they talk about what's going on at these fairs. The project fairs are sort of like a trade show where Rotary clubs who are seeking international projects go to get connected with global partners. And we believe this could be a very successful way to grow the number of clubs which can support more projects for the long-term needs that are going to continue in Ukraine. So I just want to finish by saying stay tuned, because we think there's going to be a lot more information about this. And I think that's my 3 minutes.
Thank you, Janina, and thank you all for your generosity. That update is a great segue for our presenter today, so I'd like to call Nelson Schaefer up here to introduce our speaker, Professor Jackisch.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nelson Schaefer, and I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker, who is Dr. Barry Jackisch. And the title of his presentation is called The Ukraine Crisis, 1 Year On, February 2023. Barry Jackisch is a visiting associate professor of modern European and world history. He received his PhD from the State University of New York. Dr. Jackisch's research and teaching interests include modern Germany, Russia, and Eastern Europe, Nazism and the Holocaust, comparative genocide, the age of world wars, and global and comprehensive world systems. He was born in Springfield, Ohio, but grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He attended Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio for his undergraduate. Dr. Jackisch is married with a 9-year-old son. He's been involved extensively with music as he grew up in a family who were professional musicians, and also involved with sports for most of his life. I give you Dr. Barry Jackisch.
I hear a lot of silverware and plates clanking, so I hope my talk doesn't put you off your delicious lunch, which I've already had a chance to do. I'd like to, first of all, thank Nelson for that great introduction, and to all of you for inviting me here to give a talk on what I think is a tremendously important and unfortunately timely topic. We are only a few days, as probably most of you know, removed from the 1-year anniversary of this most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think one of the things, and I'll mention this in my talk, one of the important things to remember is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine did not begin a year ago. It began already in 2014. This has been an ongoing process in which the largest country in Europe, namely Russia, has tried to destabilize, divide, and now, by all accounts, invade and perhaps eventually try to conquer the second largest nation in Europe. So, for many different reasons, this topic is tremendously important. It's one that I'm really passionate about. I've given a number of public talks on various aspects of this invasion. You won't hear me, or you'll very rarely hear me refer to it as a conflict. It is not a conflict between two equally matched sides. It is an invasion by one of the world's most powerful military forces, the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, by a country that is at the beginning of this most recent round of military invasion, much less well prepared. Ukraine has come a long way in its very bloody war with Russia. The other thing that I will point out is, and my students, if any of them were here, would second me saying this, sometimes I go on too long. Your colleagues made it clear to me that I have a very short window, and so I've tailored this talk, and I mean this genuinely. I've done various versions of this talk. I will try to keep this very brief, because one of the things that is often most enjoyable for me is the back and forth that I have a chance to have with audiences in question and answer. And so it's my hope that I can get through this fairly quickly, and then we'll have at least a few minutes at the end so that we can maybe have some of that back and forth. Again, thank you all for inviting me here. It's always great to see this level of interest in this topic. I know to a certain degree you would have been here anyway, but it's really important, and it's a topic that oftentimes is misunderstood or only partially understood. And so what I want to do today is basically two things, and this goes a long way, I hope, to trying to keep my talk brief. Rather than trying to explain the incredibly complex historical background of this invasion, what I want to do is basically two things, is sort of 2 points of emphasis today. The first is to talk about why this is such a complex topic and why it has been so intractable, so difficult to think about how we can bring it to some kind of conclusion. That's the first thing that I want to talk about today. The second thing that I want to talk about is, put very simply, why should we, as an American audience, actually care about this? Because unfortunately, not only in our country, but in many other countries around the world, there are political figures, news pundits, others who have tried to, as I'll say in my talk, muddy the waters, have tried to equivocate this conflict and say, well, we need to stay out of it because it's a war between two countries that are a long way away from America. That could not be further from the truth. And so what I want to do today is talk about those two themes and offer a few general thoughts about those. Before I get to that first panel on my slide, I also want to plug a colleague of mine. He is probably the preeminent scholar working today in Eastern European and especially Ukrainian history. He is also a Buckeye from the Dayton, Ohio area. Some of you may know him, Timothy Snyder, who is a really fantastic historian, holds an endowed chair in the history department at Yale University. And my talk today will maybe be 15 minutes, 20 minutes. If you have always been interested in the background and the depth and the complexity of the Ukraine conflict, and you want to hear roughly 27 or 28 really compelling lectures that will help you better understand this conflict, go to YouTube, type in the name Timothy Snyder, S-N-Y-D-E-R, and search The Making of Modern Ukraine. What he has done is a remarkable thing. He opened up his class at Yale University last fall, allowed it to be filmed, and it's like you're sitting in Timothy Snyder's class. This is a brilliant man. He takes you all the way back to the origins of Ukrainian history, the origins of this invasion, the origins of the Russian-Ukraine very kind of frayed relationship over time. So again, Timothy Snyder at Yale University, and it's completely free. All of the episodes are on YouTube. You don't have to log on. You don't have to give your email. You can watch these at your leisure. And if you're interested in this and you care about this, I would really recommend that you take a look at it. In addition to, you're all very busy people in addition to everything else you have to do. But it's really great. Okay. So the title of my talk today is The Russian Invasion of Ukraine, 1 year on, February of 2023. And as you all know, we are only a matter of days removed from the 1 year anniversary of what we know to be and what has captured the news headlines for a year, this massive military invasion of Ukraine that began in February of 2022 and initially was designed to knock out the leadership of a sovereign and independent Ukrainian nation with a goal eventually to really conquering and probably partially directly and indirectly occupying a large part of that country. Thankfully, that effort has failed. However, that does not mean that the last year has not been incredibly bloody. Casualty counts on the Russian side, by conservative estimates to this point, are somewhere between 140 and 150,000 killed or wounded. Ukraine has sustained probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 100,000 casualties, killed and wounded in this conflict. Even as we sit in this room right now, absolutely bloody, terrible battles are being fought in places like Bakhmut. The conditions of that fighting resemble something from 100 years ago, the trench warfare fighting in the First World War on the Western Front, where huge levels of death and chaos and destruction are happening as we sit here. And so when we think about those numbers and we think about the fact that this is happening as we sit here, I think it reinforces the fact that we should pay particularly close attention, not necessarily to my talk, but to this topic and its importance not only for what's happening in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, but for our world. And I think that's a point that I'll make on multiple occasions here. Okay. If you're not up to date on your map of European geography, I placed this in here. And you are only scratching the surface of what is often referred to as Western or so-called European Russia. And Russia is for much of its existence, has been the largest landmass in the world. But then to its immediate west, you see the large orange country of Ukraine. Ukraine is the second largest next to its eastern neighbor of Russia. You can see on this map the very substantial border that Ukraine shares with Russia to the east. Much of the fighting that has been taking place and that is taking place is in a region that runs roughly from here, this sort of eastern part of Ukraine, which you will often hear people refer to as the Donbass. This simply is a combination of two words, the Donetsk Basin. So Donbass is the reference there. This is, and has been for quite a while, a very highly contentious area. Among other things, it is mineral rich, with the second largest undeveloped natural gas deposits in Europe. Also huge reserves of coal and other resources. There is a natural resource angle to the Ukraine war that is often not talked about. I'll mention that today. And then you'll see this peninsula down here. You no doubt will have heard people talking about the Crimean Peninsula, right? That is this peninsula here, which in 2014, Vladimir Putin and Russian forces basically took over. And so Crimea is one of the areas that was formerly Ukrainian, that is, at least now as we speak, at least nominally, under Russian control, as are large parts of this eastern segment of Ukraine. So a lot of the heavy fighting that you hear about is taking place, not surprisingly, near the Russian border in the east. The Ukrainian sort of cultural center, capital, Kyiv, here in the north, and you can see how Ukraine is also bordered then to the north by Belarus, to the west by Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and interestingly, if any of you have been following this very small country of Moldova here, and very possibly Putin's next target if he succeeds in Ukraine. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay. So why is this war so difficult to understand and resolve? And that's theme one that I want to talk about today. And the first thing that I'll point to is, let me go back here, make sure that we're, okay. Is Russia's role in all of this. And if any of you do watch Timothy Snyder's series of lectures on Ukraine, you'll see he brings in a number of guest lecturers, colleagues of his at Yale. And one of them is an expert on the history of global empires, the rise and fall of various types of empires, why some empires work, why some empires ultimately fail. And the case that his colleague makes in this presentation is that Russia has one of the strongest sense of belief in its own exceptionalism. The idea that Russia is truly a world historical empire, and that, to put it bluntly, it's so fantastic that more people really deserve to benefit from it, okay? And I'm being facetious here a little bit, but that, in many ways, is a core belief of Vladimir Putin and many pro-Russian imperialist forces. That area that I showed you on the Ukraine map, that eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass, that is one of the areas that Russia has hit hardest with that propaganda, that if we even don't take all of Ukraine, we're going to hold on to that part of Ukraine nonetheless. And so Russia has done everything it possibly can. We need to be very careful. Oftentimes we see in our media a sort of dismissive attitude towards Russia, that they suffered terrible casualties, that their use of mercenaries, some of you have heard the term the Wagner Group or Wagner Group, which is a mercenary group that Russia uses to fight many of its proxy wars in various parts of the world. They've suffered terrible casualties, and we have the perception that somehow this is an empire that is rapidly in decline, that is on the verge of collapse. That is not true. You cannot underestimate Russia as an imperial force, and that desire and drive to expand is in many ways at the center of what's driving Russia. In addition to that, Russia suffers from a very long history that we can't go into today of a fundamental lack of a free and open media in its society. You don't have to pay a great deal of attention to a channel like Russia Today, RT, and some of the programs, the evening news programs where they have military and political pundits on who are saying things like, if the West keeps sending HIMARS systems, or if the West sends new battle tanks to Ukraine, we will just direct missiles on London and on Berlin. Really sort of crazy, extreme threats. But this is the standard fare for so many people. And the lack of a truly free and open media, media personalities, and there are independent groups in our society that track these things, people have died trying to report the truth in Russia. And so you have an aggressive imperialist force that deeply believes in its own mission, a very successful propaganda system that keeps its public largely in the dark about what is truly happening, and a really skilled group of people who can manipulate social media. There is a very long and sordid history about the way that Russian, some people you'll see them called bot farms, or other groups of people who have set out basically to make the case that not only is Russia not to blame, that it's Ukraine's fault, that Russia is simply responding to threats. That is a very skillful campaign that Russia has run throughout social media, and there's an entire history to how they've done that. But those three facts are a big piece of the puzzle. We as Americans also need to understand what the collapse of the old Soviet Union means to many Russians. When the Soviet Union finally ceased to exist, which was in December of 1991, and some of you will remember Mikhail Gorbachev, who has passed away a few months ago, basically oversaw the final scene where the old red Soviet flag came down and the white, red, and blue flag of Russia was raised. And so in December of 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to be as a political reality. Vladimir Putin has often, and his cronies around him, have often called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. I think there are a few others that probably might compete for that title, right? But that thinking tells you something about what their view of all of this is. That is to say, the collapse of the Soviet Union as a great military and world power that was feared by countries like the United States and European countries, China, countries around the world, fell into chaos in the 1990s. And so Vladimir Putin, when he came to power at the beginning of the 2000s, has basically built his career on resurrecting the power of the old Soviet Union, repackaged in some ways, not so repackaged in other ways, as a way of trying to project Russian power again as the old Soviet system did. So while we may think, what a great thing it was, democracy, freedom of the press, all of these values that we think about, many average Russians, and especially those at the top of the pyramid in today's Russia, view the collapse of the Soviet Union very differently. Okay? Fourth, there is an endlessly complicated relationship going back centuries between Russia and the old Russian Empire, really beginning with Peter the Great at the beginning of the 18th century. It should tell you something, incidentally, that when Putin compares himself to other previous Russian leaders, the leader that he most often chooses is Peter the Great. So if you don't know who Peter the Great is, take a look and then get a sense of what that might tell you about Putin's view of the world. In fact, there is a very complicated relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine became a fully sovereign and independent nation after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. It tragically surrendered its nuclear stockpile in 1994, but never let anyone tell you, well, Ukraine has never really existed as a sovereign nation. That is a historical falsehood. But it is one of the ways that pro-Russian apologists try to muddy the waters and claim, well, Ukraine was kind of always part of the Soviet Union, or it was kind of always part of the Russian Empire. And what they're doing there, and I don't have time to go into detail on this, they are trading on very complex historical ideas. Yes, for a large part of Ukraine's history, as we see it on that map today, Western Ukraine was part of what was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which collapsed after the First World War. And yes, it is true that parts of Eastern Ukraine, for much of its history, had been at various times part of either the old Russian Empire or under the Soviet Union. But Ukraine emerges from the collapse of the Soviet Union, as do many other smaller countries which are now independent. And they stand on their own as an independent nation. So what's happening there is Putin and others' attempts to try to use a very complicated historical background to now muddy the waters and say, well, there really is no such thing as Ukraine. Putin is quite fond of saying Ukraine never really existed. It was a creation of the communist revolutionaries in the Russian Revolution of 1917. Or he can argue, well, there may be a handful of Ukrainian nationalists, but all those Ukrainian nationalists who believe in an independent Ukraine, they're fascists, they're Nazis. One of the justifications that Putin made in invading Ukraine a little over a year ago was that Russia had to move in and denazify Russia. All right, Timothy Snyder, the very famous Yale historian I mentioned, has called this schizo-fascism. It is the worst kind of political projection you can imagine. Putin displays almost every aspect of fascistic and Nazi-like tendencies in the use of propaganda, in his extreme hyper-nationalism, all of these things, and then he projects those ideas onto a free and independent country. So again, don't buy into these claims that Ukraine never existed. It's a lie. Fifth on the list here, fossil fuels. This is one of the most overlooked parts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine, the so-called Donbass, sits on, again, as I said, the second largest documented, researched, undeveloped natural gas collections in Europe. It also sits on huge coal reserves and other minerals. And so in a world where we are still very much reliant, as much as we are trying to pivot away from gas and oil, one of the things that Russia is doing there is trying to lock down those resources. Keep in mind, Russia for many decades had been the world's #1 exporter of natural gas. And when we think of oil products, we think of places like Saudi Arabia or Iran. Russia was the second largest global exporter of oil for decades. And so this expansion in Ukraine and this attempt to get a hold of these kinds of resources fits with this profile of today's Russia as a petro giant that is heavily reliant on what are called petrodollars. In other words, money that you get from selling oil and gas products on the global market, right? So it's important not to overlook that aspect of this. And the last thing in this category before I get to my last point is a fundamentally warped Russian view of the West. And there are many, unfortunately, important parts to this issue, but I want to only touch on a couple of those. You will hear Putin and other of his allies talk about the idea that the West, the United States, destroyed the Soviet Union, and ever since, with NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, the US and the West has been, quote unquote, out to get Russia. And finally, Russia drew a line in the sand and said, no more, we are moving into Ukraine, you are not going to take over Ukraine. What is happening there is, again, this example of projection, where instead of admitting that you've invaded a sovereign country to your west, what you're basically arguing is a victim narrative. Putin and many other Russian leaders love to use the victim narrative, that the West and the United States have been out to get them. And look at what happened to us in the 1990s. The Soviet Union collapsed. Isn't that enough for all of you? And finally, we're going to stand up for ourselves and fight back. That is a very warped view of reality, but it is a central feature of Russian thinking. You will also hear very often, and if any of you have paid attention to the kind of crazy speech that Putin gave only a couple of days ago on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, and he talks about this in almost an obsessed way, is the idea that Russia is the only country left in the European tradition that still upholds so-called traditional values. One of the things that Putin does frequently, and his cronies do frequently, is attack alternative lifestyles, LGBTQ. He mentioned multiple times in his speech that the West is obsessed with pedophilia. I mean, this is really bizarre stuff. And what he is trying to do there is he is trying to discredit the United States and other Western countries as basically having been corrupted by globalism, by the forces of global liberalism, and that Russia is the only country left that stands up to these kinds of things, and therefore you should support us no matter what we do, okay? The last thing that you'll hear Putin talk about, and this is where I will dabble a little bit in the history, it's important to understand how significant. World War II was tremendously important for the United States, right? Many of you have perhaps relatives in your own family who served or perhaps even fought and died. World War II is a turning point in our own country's history. You cannot understand modern Russian/Soviet history without understanding the role of what Russians call the Great Patriotic War. Okay? That's when Russians often talk about that, average Russians, and certainly when Putin talks about it, they don't say World War II, they say the Great Patriotic War. Okay? And conservative estimates suggest that the Soviet Union at the time suffered somewhere between 25 and 27 million casualties, civilian and military, in Russia's fighting against Nazi Germany. By comparison, the total Soviet casualties at the Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point battle of World War II between the late 1942 and early 43, surpassed U.S. total combat casualties for the entire war. Okay? So, without making excuses, it is tremendously important to realize that World War II holds an iconic place in Russia's collective historical memory. So when Putin says we are going to denazify Ukraine, he is tying into a very specific historical rhetoric, which is, we fought these bastards off, we saved the world in the Second World War, and now we have to go back and do it again. And if any of you, if you think this is crazy, that's not true. Go back and look up Putin's speeches that he gave recently on the anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad, the liberation of the siege of Leningrad. He specifically makes this connection. Okay? If any of you have paid attention, Germany is sending the Leopard main battle tank to help Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Putin specifically mentioned that. Yet again, we have German tanks threatening us, he says. Okay? This is a crazy historical conflation, but it's very central to the Russian kind of view of its place in the world. How are we doing on time? I don't have a clock here. 5 more minutes? Great. See, I told you. I run on a little bit. Okay, this is the last thing. So why should we care about this? First of all, I mentioned this at the beginning of my talk. This is not a war, and I want to stress this. This is not a conventional war between two roughly equal powers who were fighting over a particular area, and so we can say, hey, that's their thing. Let's just let them fight. That's a long way away. It's thousands of miles away. Let them fight it out. Whoever wins, wins. This is an imperialistic invasion by the largest country in Europe of the second largest country in Europe, and Ukraine is fighting for its life every single day. So don't let someone use that kind of language and conflate a roughly equal war between equal powers and what has happened here, okay? Also keep in mind, this all started again in 2014. If some of you remember the so-called Euromaidan protests that took place in Ukraine, where they threw out a Putin-backed political leader, which kicked all this off. If you ever expect truth from Putin, go back and look at the 2014 period when Putin was sending special forces units into Ukraine without any Russian army or battle insignias on them. They were called, if you remember this phrase at the time, little green men, right? Who Russian special forces were sending in to coordinate the Russian seizure of Crimea and other parts of Ukraine at the time. Putin lies. If his lips are moving, he's usually lying, okay? So remember, this is not just about 2022, it's also going back further to this to 2014. And even if you are the most cold-hearted person in this room, and I'm not passing judgment on you, but even if you say, you know what, terrible stuff happens in the world everywhere, I can point to 5 or 10 other places right now where horrible things are going on, I don't care. That's their problem. I'm going to focus on what I'm dealing with. Keep in mind that if Putin is allowed to pull this off, there are other big countries watching this, notably China, who right now is actually debating whether or not they are going to send offensive weaponry to supply the Russian army. Okay? China is taking a calculated risk that a weak U.S. response or a weak Western response to what Russia is doing in Ukraine may translate to what might happen someday if China decides to launch a full military invasion of Taiwan. So even if you don't care about the hundreds of thousands of people who have died, and I'm again being facetious here, in terms of global strategic politics, this matters a lot, okay? Another reason that we want to remember, and this is point 3, how do you deal with authoritarian regimes? One of the things that the U.S. faces in this world is a shift. You know, we've heard a lot about globalization and how that's brought us closer, whatever globalization means. I have a course that I teach at the University of Toledo about defining globalization, what that is, and most people aren't even really clear about what globalization is. But one of the things that scholars have argued recently is that we are possibly entering in a phase of deglobalization, where individual nation states are falling under the charms of, again, totalitarian leaders who are trying to pursue their own national interests. If the U.S. does not deal with Russia in a very strong and assertive fashion in Ukraine, we will be facing this again and again in our future global foreign policy. And so it's an important test. It is also, to your point, a human rights and a human disaster, right? There are estimates that over 10 million Ukrainians have been displaced as a result of this war. Germany has taken in over 1 million. Poland has taken in several million. Many countries have stepped up and taken in Ukrainians. But something else has happened. Russia has gone into Ukraine and has captured thousands of Ukrainian children and taken them back into Russia to Russify them, to remove their Ukrainian identity and turn them into good Russians. Do you know who else did that? Hitler and the SS did in the Second World War in their invasion of Eastern European countries like Poland and again Ukraine, where Aryan or children who were deemed to be worthy enough were simply kidnapped from their families and taken back and Germanized. This is a page directly out of that playbook. So we are talking about a human rights crisis that is happening under our very eyes. We also need to be aware of Russian aggression beyond Ukraine. You don't have to listen to the crazies on RT, Russian propaganda television, when they're talking about, well, once we've cleaned up Ukraine, we're going to move into Moldova, that small country I pointed out on the map earlier. Well, only within the last week, now they're starting to talk about readjusting Poland's borders. And if you know anything about the long history of the relationship between Poland and Russia and the Soviet Union in the 19th and the 20th century, don't believe that that's not on the agenda, okay? So Ukraine is not just about Ukraine, it's also about other places that Russia may end up going. The last 2 points I want to make, and then I'll take some questions. Russia is also the world's largest nuclear power. They love to remind us of it on almost every occasion, daily, weekly, when Putin makes stern, veiled threats about if we're pushed too far, we may have to use every weapon in our arsenal. If you listen to Russian propaganda television, they talk about aiming nuclear missiles at London, at Paris, at Berlin, okay? That's not us talking this talk and using this rhetoric. This is a country that is constantly saying, be careful, don't push us too far, we might use nuclear weapons. And of course, that threat is one of the things that has allowed people to say, well, we need to be careful not to escalate too far with Putin. And to those people I say, what the hell do you think is happening right now? The escalation is over with. The entire debate about whether or not Putin will order the use of nuclear weapons, which I will say very shortly, I don't think so for lots of different reasons, cannot be a basis of policy for the United States, because then you are simply giving into perhaps the biggest bullying threat in the world, okay? And last, some American pundits have said, oh, we're spending all of this money on Ukraine, and who cares about Ukraine? And Ukraine is on the other side of the world, and why are we sending this? Last year, we spent about 5% of our total defense budget on Ukraine. Many of you will understand the concept of ROI, right? We are getting phenomenal ROI on the very limited amount of money that we have invested in Ukraine. In terms of military expenditures, that number is somewhere around 28 billion. Total economic support for Ukraine in the last year and a half is probably now between 60 and 65 billion. Afghanistan cost us 1.4 trillion. Okay? So we are stalling and hopefully in the coming year going to drive back and fundamentally weaken and destabilize one of the world's great political powers for a fractional amount of our own defense budget. So no matter how you approach this issue, it's tremendously important. There are many aspects to it, but the one thing that I will leave you with today is it matters a whole hell of a lot, and it doesn't matter just because it's happening thousands of miles away from us, but it affects all of us, and it affects the United States as we sit here in this room today. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple questions.
First question.
Yep.
Your impression, is it the weakness of NATO and engagement of NATO and USA in Iran-Iraq war and then Afghanistan war, which has enabled Putin and encouraged him to undertake this, what we call irredental invasion?
The short answer to that question is I believe it is absolutely one of the justifications that he uses. In reality, it is not the case. One of the things that Putin is quite fond of is to say, how dare you, the United States and the West, lecture me on what I'm doing in Ukraine after what you did with the invasion of Iraq, right? He's very fond of this false equivocation, okay? I'm not going to go into U.S. foreign policy here. We have made plenty of our own mistakes, and I think there's a very good case to be made that the invasion of Iraq was one of those mistakes.
I think it's inability to include Ukraine along with other Eastern European countries. if we can take
You mean
Poland,
you mean
another
the
country,
failure to
why-
bring...
Exactly.
Yes.
Why not Ukraine?
That is, so there's a very long answer to that. So the point that you're making there is, why was Ukraine not more rapidly brought in, integrated into NATO? I understand what you're
That's my
saying.
main question.
So there are two things very quickly. That was a terrible mistake, and one of the very complicated issues there, and there's a scholar in particular who has written on this. The simple answer to your question is, Ukraine, after its independence, did not feel, number one, that it would face any kind of major threat. It had a fairly sizable Russian-speaking minority, especially in the eastern part of the country, who nonetheless voted substantially for Ukrainian independence when the Soviet Union collapsed, okay? So there was the perception that we're not sure that we need the protection of NATO in the position that we're in. But the second reason is Ukraine also in 1994 surrendered after much pressure from the West, from the United States, surrendered its nuclear stockpile, that it had a substantial nuclear stockpile back to Russia. And in exchange for that surrender, Ukraine received what at the time were suggested to be ironclad guarantees about its sovereignty. That was one of the biggest mistakes, without question, that Ukraine made, giving up its nuclear weapons in that scenario. But I agree with you, those points are exactly right.
So perhaps a hypothetical question, so unfair.
Yeah.
Do you think things would change dramatically if Putin was out of the equation, someone else was the leader?
So I love this question. It's an excellent question. And historians refer to these as, it's not necessarily hypothetical, we talk about them as counterfactual questions, right? Where we can debate the what if. Like, what if this would have happened? What if Lincoln had not been shot? Okay? And that question has come up in every public talk that I've given on this. What if Putin were somehow removed? Or some of you have seen speculation that perhaps Putin is suffering from Parkinson's or some kind of cancer. There have been some very strange public appearances that he's made. All of you may have noted the kind of crazy, because it became a meme, you know, Putin sitting at these ridiculously long tables, right, to avoid being contaminated with COVID or whatever else. Here's the point, and this came up at our discussion over lunch before I came up here. Many historians have made the comparison to Hitler and Nazi Germany, and they've argued, wow, if we could have just gotten rid of Hitler, things would have been so much better. My response to this is, be very careful what you wish for, because what that question does not address is the fact that authoritarian leaders, usually the one thing if they're not good at a lot of other things, they're usually really good at creating a political culture around them that prevents succession planning. They don't want to have to quit their job. And this is absolutely the case with Putin. He poisons his political opponents. He has done everything he possibly can to prevent a kind of political culture where you could have alternative political people with different views competing with you. And even in that scenario, if somehow Putin were to die next month, let's say, or if he were taken out by someone in his inner circle, God forbid us, depending on who might replace him. As bad as Putin is, and I said this at the table over here before, at least so far, I would take the man that we've been able to study for the last 20 years and who constantly threatens, like the boy who cried wolf, using nuclear weapons, than Germasov, or even worse, the Chechen leader who's leading Chechen forces in the invasion of Ukraine, who could take over and wouldn't threaten to do it, would simply use those weapons. So I think we need to be careful to focus on one particular individual and say removing that person will solve all of our problems. What will have to happen in a similar way, scholars have made the argument, we will have to have in Russia what happened in Nazi Germany, which is a clear defeat and then somehow initiating a change in the political culture of that country. Yeah. 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 Absolutely. There's a lot of speculation on it. Yeah. Yeah. I will tell, I know we're out of time. I'll tell one other this is the last thing I'll say. Putin has carefully managed his own propaganda stories that people tell about him. And if you look up, you can Google this, you can look up the Putin rat story. And this will tell you, I think, quite a bit, because Putin actually allows this to be told about him. It's in a kind of a weird autobiography that he did about 15, 18 years ago. In any event, he grew up in poverty, which is true. in a very kind of literally rat-infested apartment building in St. Petersburg in the post-World War II era. And one of the things that he did is he was an undersized, skinny little kid, and he would constantly get in fights with other kids. It's one of the reasons he claims that he went into martial arts so that he could defend himself. This is his kind of his narrative, his story. And the story he loves to tell is what he and his buddies would go when he was young, early teens or whatever. They would get sticks, and they would chase rats inside the building. And one time Putin said, "I'm going to show off how tough I am." And he found the biggest rat, and he cornered the rat. And he goes to raise his stick to hit the rat, and the rat lunges at him. And he turns around terrified, and he runs back into his apartment. And he says, what's the moral of that story? He says, it's two things. He said, you can never predict what someone will do when they're cornered. And number two, never allow yourself to be dominated by something you can't control. And he tells that story repeatedly, and I think we should maybe listen to that if we want to know a little bit about his psyche. So anyway, thank you all very much. No, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jackisch, for that great presentation and the update on Ukraine and the brief little history lesson. Appreciate that. He's able to stick around afterwards to answer some questions if you have a few more. And as a thank you, we'd like to give this book, Historical Tales of Toledo, that was written by one of our past presidents, Clint Mauck. And we also will be providing a donation to the Polio Plus Fund in your name.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Very briefly, I'd like to thank our guests that are here today, Earl Mack and Dr. Hickson Hudson, and then also Jane Marie for the great reflection, and Nelson for your introduction of Dr. Jackisch. We have one meeting today. It is the Peace Subcommittee, which will be meeting in, Summit A. And with that, we are all adjourned. Try to stay dry on your way home, or way back to work, I should say.